This video is sponsored by my day job. All views and opinions are my own. Likes and subs are appreciated, but don't hit the notification button. Does anybody actually even do that? Seems annoying. Don't do that. You ever get jealous that Xbox owners have exclusives like Halo? And, well, no, I think it's just Halo. Sony has a long line of awesome exclusives, going back a few console generations. And we have some favorites. So let's get into it. Welcome back to JBG. Here's another impromptu video, just cause it was on my mind. Since the PS1 came out, I've been a PlayStation fanboy. I know a lot of people will have some older titles in their version of this list, but I really feel like the PS4 and PS5 era has topped a couple decades of their previous work. As usual, I'm going to try and keep it as spoiler-free as possible, just in case you haven't had these spoiled for you yet. So here's a look at JBG's top 5 Sony exclusives. At number 5, a somewhat divisive selection, I have Death Stranding. I don't think I could really spoil this game for you, even if I did a 20-minute video on the story. It's just, well, a Hideo Kojima game. This is a game you really have to play to understand the draw. It seems like an unshamed Kojima production. This game is insanely bizarre. It's a post-apocalyptic world where you play as Sam Bridges, essentially a delivery man. That's one of the last connections to pockets of society. The world is infested with what they call beach things, or BTs. Not seen by the naked eye, only detected through the use of bridge babies, or BBs. These are babies that survived in utero while the mother died, giving them a connection to the other side. I told you it was bizarre. The core story of the game is essentially an attempt to reconnect all the pockets of civilization. Now this thing has been described as a walking simulator, and that's not entirely wrong. The main gameplay loop is basically fetch quests. This is where it becomes so divisive too. While some people will find it an empty world with boring and repetitive gameplay, others will find relaxation and find the traversal mechanics engaging. Every step you take, especially at the beginning, needs to be intentional. It's all deliberate. Terrain elements pose the main threats through the world. Getting over rocks or a mountain to save time at a greater risk of losing your cargo, or taking the long route for safer terrain but at the risk of time requirements, or longer term exposure to damage to the cargo. It's something you really need to put a few hours into to know which camp you'll fall into. As with every Kojima game, it's heavy on the cinematics, and will have about 40 plot twists to wrap up the game. This story is so strange and ambiguous, you might even need 2 playthroughs to really understand half of what you saw towards the end of the game. Even with my love of bizarre things, I was caught off guard how it goes off the rails. I obviously fall in the camp that appreciates the deliberate movement mechanics and relaxing gameplay. I'd say the downside is this can artificially extend the playtime. But this was somewhat addressed in the director's cut. You get non-lethal weapons almost immediately, and there's gear to speed up the traversal process. I think this is a direct response to players that just got bored with how slow and intentional the movement speed was. The director's cut also brings up an amazing graphic display into something that is borderline photorealistic throughout. While a slower, relaxing paced experience, there's definitely some action here too, but I wouldn't call this an action game by any stretch. If you're into a slow burn of a game that you definitely won't be predicting the next plot twist in the storyline, this might be the title for you. The director's cut is free if you have PS Plus too, so definitely worth a try if you can get it for free. At number 4, I have what I consider one of the classics of the PS4 era, Horizon Zero Dawn. I know the sequel came out this year, it just didn't hit as hard for me the way the first one did. The world is 1,000 years past our current civilization, and is populated what can best be described as mechanical dinosaurs and tribes of humans struggling to survive. You play as Aloy, an orphan that is outcast from her own tribe, the Nora, just for being an orphan. As a kid, she finds a piece of old world tech called a Focus, giving her what most of the primitive tribes see as supernatural abilities tied to the forbidden technologies. After the intro, you pick up trying to be accepted by your old tribe and get answers to where you came from. The story here is what I found fascinating, but the big draw of the game at launch was the machines you were going to be fighting throughout. And although not as refined as Forbidden West, the combat here is still tight and holds up. There's not exactly a level system for enemies. You can pretty much just sense on sight which you should attack or avoid. As you progress and open up stronger weapons and tactics, you know what level of enemy you can take on. I'll say the spear is almost worthless if not in a sneak attack scenario in Zero Dawn though. It's more focused in Forbidden West and balanced much better, but there's a caveat to this. Why do I rank Zero Dawn here over Forbidden West? While I found the story to be tighter and the gameplay loop to not be as drawn out, I still haven't finished Forbidden West. I just really got bored with it. Just in the opening, I don't think there's any significant gameplay for at least an hour. They could have cut the storylines in half and kept my attention much better. That's why I personally think the story makes the first entry a much stronger game. And although not as impressive graphically as Forbidden West, Zero Dawn still holds up very well. This title was free to all PlayStation users a couple years back. With Forbidden West on PS Plus now also, I would strongly suggest playing through the main story of Zero Dawn first. You're not going to understand what's going on the first hour of Forbidden West. For this one, I have a PS3, PS4, and PS5 game. At number 3, I have The Last of Us. With the show kind of distorting the character development, I find myself appreciating the story of this game more and more. Yet another post-apocalyptic game here, noticing a trend. This one is closer to the horror shooter than the previous ones though. You play as Joel, a smuggler in one of the last cities left standing after a fungus evolved to take over human minds, and basically turn them into walking means of spreading the fungus. Fanboys will say it's not a zombie game. For all intents and purposes, it's in the zombie genre at least. Joel ends up getting sucked into smuggling a kid out of the city, Ellie, and the story goes from there. The main story isn't anything too original, to be honest. The draw of the narrative is the character arcs. It turns from a hesitant smuggler getting pulled into a situation to a father figure who would do anything for the kid that they initially hated. The gameplay here can be a little clunky at times. There's a huge focus on stealth in the first playthrough, but it's the story beats between characters that makes this one of the all-time greats. I personally wouldn't suggest picking up the remake unless you find it dirt cheap, and that's a remake in quotes. I have a bit of buyer's remorse after finding out the only noticeable change is the upgraded graphics and the bugs that come with a graphics rebuild. You can get the PS4 remastered cheap pretty much anywhere nowadays, and I'm glad they never, ever made a sequel that all over the characters they spent so much time getting you to love. Never, ever made one. Another late generation PS4 release that pushed the limits of what the console could do. At number 2, I have Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost is a fictional story set in the Mongol invasion of Japan. You play as Jin Sakai, one of the last remaining samurai after the initial fight with the Mongols on the island of Tsushima. The story at its most simple level is fighting to repel the Mongol invaders from the island. The draw here is the insanely gorgeous setting and the satisfying combat. This was sold on the guiding wind mechanic that minimizes the HUD and UI during exploration, meaning you have to look around more at the actual environment instead of a mini-map, and it totally worked. Even on the launch version, this was gorgeous. Surprisingly, the initial version has some of the fastest loading times in the PS4 generation, and I played it on the launch PS4. The PS5 version removes almost all loading altogether. It's impressive no matter how many times I fast travel, it goes right back to the action. But back to the combat. The combat in Ghost is probably the most fluid and satisfying you can find in any sword-based combat game. There's a total lack of lock-on in this game, but I think this is by design. You aren't going to need to lock on to almost any enemy because you're not fighting them long enough for it to be usable. It would hinder the ability to change the attack direction needed for it to remain this fluid. The general individual combatant is only going to take a few strikes to dispatch. This game also has a free PS5 version on PS Plus. That upgrades most aspects of this game, and the haptics completely change the feedback you get from games like this. The graphic updates are subtle, but it was already an amazing looking game in the last gen. This is the prime example of a late generation game that already looked next gen when it released, and I totally recommend giving it a run, especially if you can pick it up free on PS Plus. So once again, I'm gonna cheat. At number 1, I have the God of Wars. I include both here for a few reasons. First being, I definitely like God of War 2018. Its story arc resembled The Last of Us in a lot of ways. Here being a father and son developing a relationship that never really existed before. And it's a great standalone story. But when I played Ragnarok, I appreciated 2018 so much more. I actually went and played through the original trilogy after it never really hit home before for me, just because of how they tied up the ending of Ragnarok. Without having played 2018 though, Ragnarok would miss so many of the impactful moments. In fact, without knowing the originals, the ending will miss one of the most heartfelt moments I've seen in modern gaming. Both these games play very similar in the single camera shot angle with a tight field of view through combat and exploration. I would say the combat in 2018 would get a bit repetitive late game just because of enemy variety, but there's still the one-offs that kept you going at the end. Ragnarok was much more like the original trilogy in so many ways, including the brutality of finishers that didn't hit as well in 2018. Plus the blade grapple mechanics, everything felt a lot more like the older ones in the modernized perspective. These were supposed to be a trilogy, so there's going to be some pacing issues mid-game through Ragnarok. But if you look at these as a single game, the way I do with God of War 2 and 3, It smooths those out a bit. I honestly think this should have been Game of the Year for 2022 over Elden Ring, and I played the shit out of that game. Even after the storyline of 2018 was so heartfelt, I didn't think I would get so choked up at the conclusion of Ragnarok like I did. Both of these have such satisfying combat systems that expand in the second one, and I think this is some of the best storytelling a Sony publisher has ever put out. I'm glad Sony's starting to port their exclusives on a regular basis over to PC. Let PC players get a chance to play some of these. There's a few decades of gems out there, but I really feel like these are the ones that hit the hardest for me. Any of these fit on your list of Sony exclusives? Or did you pick up any of these as a PC port? Let me know in the comments if you have different favorite PlayStation exclusive. Or if you played on the PC, did it translate well to the PC? Until next time.
Anybody need a snack? Kratos? Snack?
I do not need a snack.
What? Toodaloo, motherfucker. Hey.